It seems like you enjoy it enough where you let me keep doing it. So until you tell me enough, I guess we'll just keep going. Um, One of the things that I've had the privilege to do up there in my congregation in Kentucky is I'm teaching one of the Bible classes with a couple older gentlemen, and we're going through 1st and 2nd Samuel and a little bit of Kings and Chronicles. What we're talking about is kind of the dichotomy between Saul and David, and man's king, God's king, how God brings about his will, uses his sovereign power to get Israel to realize that his way is always going to be better than man's way, and how he uses that pattern throughout the biblical narrative to really show that once again, and even today in this present age, he still emphasizes that point through the scriptures. So what I wanted to look at today is something that I just found interesting early on in the class. We started at the beginning of this year in January. Is one of the topics was not about Saul and David, but starting at the very beginning of the book of 1 Samuel. If you want to go ahead, turn there, because that's where our primary reading is going to come from this morning. The book of 1 Samuel starts with not Samuel, but the mother of Samuel. Even before Samuel is conceived, you have this story that we all know very well, the story of his mother, Hannah. Hebrew word, the name Anna, or Anah, mean grace. The name Hannah, meaning specifically grace from God, is where we get her name. And it's a story that we all know very well. It's the story where Hannah prays for a family. She doesn't have a family, and we're going to be talking about a lot of the same characters and themes that we went over in Bible class, which kind of complement each other nicely. My dad and I didn't really coordinate too much, but there's going to be a bit of overlap there, so I hope I can kind of expound upon and maybe bring out some more things that we started to talk about in the Bible class earlier today. So before we get too much into it, I just want to go ahead. We're going to read the first chapter of Samuel. We're going to be reading verses 4 through 11, and that's going to be our core text that we kind of look at. And towards the end, we're going to get into chapter 2 a little bit. So let's go ahead. I'm going to be starting with verse 4 of 1 Samuel. And it reads, "And when the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. And it happened that year after year, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her, so she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, 'Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?' Then Hannah rose, after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. And she, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord, and wept bitterly. And she made a vow and said, 'O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thy maidservant, and remember me, and not forget thy maidservant, but wilt thou give thy maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head.'" So like I said, a story we all know very well, but I kind of want to look at it a little bit deeper and see what that application can be, because we have this case study here. I believe it's the first instance in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament where we have a woman specifically praying to God in this way. So we want to look at Hannah's prayer for family, and there's 3 aspects. The first one, we're going to look at Hannah's pain, the scenario and the situation that Hannah was in that caused her to cry out to the Lord to make this request, this fervent prayer. Next, we're going to look at the change of heart, the transformation that God did in Hannah that brought about the answering of this prayer? What was it that Hannah did inwardly that made God realize that she was ready to have her prayer answered? And then the third aspect we're going to look at is the rejoicing of Hannah. What Hannah does in response to having her prayer answered, and how that can be something that we look in our own prayer life. So we're going to go ahead and look at, like I said, the first aspect is what was causing Hannah so much grief. It seems like when we read this, it doesn't seem like she's having a very good time with her home life and her situation there. But if you look at the Hebrew text, and especially the context and the sociological times, you begin to see that it's even more deeper. The text in translation kind of softens it a bit, not to any fault of its own. But in verse 10, it says that she wept in the bitterness of her soul. And the Hebrew here seems to indicate that there was an inward pain that started in her heart or her soul, a bitter pain, but it was so agonizing that it would cause her outward pain, that she would wail or moan. It was so intense that she was expressing it outwardly, is kind of the idea there, because of this provocation by the other wife of Elkanah, Peninnah, which, interesting, this is just a side note, is the Hebrew word for toasted bread, which is where we also get our term for sandwich today is panini. If those names sound familiar to you, that's not a coincidence. Her name literally is the name of a sandwich that we have now today, but I just thought that was an interesting little note on the Hebrew there. So so you have Hannah, whose name means grace, and then you have this other wife whose names mean toasted bread. So you kind of have that interesting, even though one was being mean to the other, I think in terms of names, she got the better name there. Verse 6, it says that she was irritated and embarrassed by Peninnah. And then the word for irritated means that she roared with anger, that she was so furious that she had to put up with this taunting and this absolute ridicule and the shame that came upon her, that it caused her to be stormed with anger. And I mean, you can just kind of think about the scenarios in which Hannah would be in this situation with another wife of her husband, one that's brought him children, and think about the fact that, maybe she had to do more chores because, oh, I'm tired, I have to take care of the kids, or would you do this for me, I have to take care of the kids, and all this stuff. And it begins to feel for Hannah, maybe at some points, like she's not even a wife, but maybe more of a housemaid or a servant, because she doesn't have the responsibility. But we know that even though this wasn't the case, Elkanah still looked at her favorably. It says that he goes to her and he has a conversation we'll look at later, but it's very important to look, something interesting here, is that contextually, in those times, having children was a very big deal because of what children provided and what they meant in terms of social status. Now, we might know it's actually common enough, barrenness in women, the inability to conceive a child, is still common enough where we've probably all known someone, or if you've experienced yourself, you know the pain and sorrow it comes to have the news told to you that you do not have the ability to conceive a child, that there's nothing you can do, it's not going to be something that you're capable of. And of course, that's a painful thing to experience in modern day culture because you're not going to have the emotional fulfillment of having a child of your own, and that's really tough. But I want to make sure we're clear that this is nothing compared to what Hannah was experiencing back in her day and time and the culture that was pressing upon her from all sides. Because back then, the way it worked is you supported yourself by having a family trade, as everybody contributed by having a business of some sort, or by having something that they contributed to society. And in order to keep that trade ongoing, well, what did you do? You had kids, you taught them that trade, you taught them the family business, and then they would take it over as you grew into your older age, and they would take over and continue to provide for the family. Not only that, but when you got even older than that, and it got to the point that you couldn't provide for yourself, your children would be the ones to take care of you in your old age, as that's still the case. But the idea was the more children that you had, the more abundant your wealth would be, and the more taken care of you would be as you became older and older. And so children were very much a status symbol. They were an indicator of success. The more children you had, the more blessed you were, the more well-off you were. Another thing to think about is in terms of conquest. When it came to military and it came to having all these neighboring cities and people going door to door and taking over, well, where do you get your army from? Where do you get your soldiers? You get them from the people who have the kids. So the more kids you have, the more enlistees you have for your army. If the tribe next door or the city next door, if they're able to have more kids than you, especially at an exponential rate, well, guess what? If it gets to the point where they feel like they have more than you, they might come over and take you over. So you also have to think about the fact that women were considered military heroes to a certain extent because they were able to advance the cause by having more kids to go into the army. So there's another component of that that's interesting to bring out. You also have to think about the fact that mortality back then was about at 40%. 4 out of 10 kids who were born were able to make it to adulthood. And adulthood would be considered back then about mid-20s to 30. And then, because there was so much disease and just stuff that was happening back then, your mid-30s were thought of about, maybe middle-aged or even maybe a little more than that. So with all of these factors you have to think about, Hannah was really, really discouraged because not only did she not have the emotional fulfillment of having a child of her own, she was a disgrace to society. She was nothing in the eyes of not only Peninnah, but all the other women around her and just the society at large. So something you have to think about is not only for Hannah, but for any woman in that situation, how much pressure there would be to turn family into something not to be cherished and nurtured, but something to be coveted. Family became almost idolatrous for Hannah, and that was a danger, is that you have this idea that it's something you have to have. It's something you need to get if you're going to be anything. And it's very dangerous, and it's still very prevalent today, is that society is doing the same thing, is it's taking things at large, anything that isn't God, and telling you, if you're going to be anyone of importance, if you're going to have any love, validation, acceptance, these are the things you have to have. Sociologically, the idea used to be keeping up with the Joneses, right? The people across the street. Well, they got the new TV, they got the new lawnmower. When are you going to get that? It is multiplied 1,000 times when you have social media and everything, and you can see what the richest of the rich people have, and you can see everything progressing, and it can be very damaging. We need to be very careful that we're not also looking at other things that are being used as a status symbol, just as Hannah was pressured to back then. Is the family unit was pushed on women in such a way that they were told to put their entire self-worth, their entire identity into whether or not they could have children and how many children they could have. Culture keeps putting things in front of us that aren't God, that tells us that that's where happiness and validation comes from. That's not true at all. Whether it be children or love or achievement, those aren't things that we get from anywhere else but from God. Just a quick thing I wanted to talk about very briefly, just something I thought was interesting, is a few years ago, maybe a decade back at this time, there was an article, I believe it was in the New York Times, of a woman who had escaped from Iran, a very oppressive society for women, and she was living in Paris at the time. And the interviewer was trying to get her to talk about how free she has been now that she escaped from this culture where women were not meant to be seen, that they had to be covered, that they weren't about to be allowed to drive, that they were thought more of as property. And she was like, how wonderful it is that you don't have to deal with that anymore. And the woman was saying something very astounding, and the interviewer was pushing back, and they have this back and forth. But what the woman who had escaped from Iran was saying was that, yes, I'm free in a practical sense, but I look at the society around me, and I see women who are, in a sociological sense, just as trapped and put upon as I was in Iran, with all these standards that they have for women, with all these, these magazines and these models that they have, and these indicators of success. They said, so yes, practically I am free, that I don't have to deal with the physical forcings of that culture, but I see women having to put up with the standards that are put upon them, and I don't think it's that different. And that was very hard for the interviewer to hear, that she might be in a similar situation to this woman that escaped. And that just kind of brought to mind, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So Hannah, in her pain, deep pain, deep sorrow, is what motivates her to turn to God. So now we're going to look at Hannah's change of heart. What is it? Well, we know that Elkanah was making it worse, probably wasn't trying to, but he's going to her and he's talking about how much he loves her and how his love should be enough for her. His love should be that of greater than 10 sons. And of course, Elkanah, probably this irritates her, seeing Elkanah heap praise upon his wife. So she pushes and digs the knife and more, which makes Hannah even sadder. So you have this negative feedback loop that goes on and on. And as my dad mentioned in the Bible class, the Bible doesn't do too much hand-holding in the way of saying, especially in the Old Testament, what is right and what is wrong. But there's a biblical commentator named Robert Alter who I think points this out very well, is that you have in Genesis God's plan for marriage. The family unit is to be one man, one wife, and children. And then you have other examples of polygamy throughout the Bible where this plan is deviated from. And people say, well, it's never expressly condemned. No, but if you look at every instance in which polygamy is practiced, women especially are very, very unhappy. And we looked at the example of Abraham and Sarai today specifically. Now we're looking at Hannah. But it makes everybody else unhappy, and it just seems to breed contempt and misery more than anything else, is that you're not going to find an example of polygamy in the Bible where it seems like everything's hunky-dory and it's going well. God establishes example and a unit for a reason, and when we see that deviated from, we don't see any good emerge from it. So Robert Alter then goes on to say that there's something interesting here, is that Peninnah represents the hope of women in that society at that time, the sociological hope, that I could be a woman and have many, many children, that I can provide these children for my husband, that my family will be elevated, and I'll be brought to another level of society. But then he goes on to say, for us, it's interesting that Elkanah, in the way he treats Hannah, is the hope of women in this society, more psychological than sociological, is that he gives her validation. He says, hey, you are enough for me. I love you so much. You are perfect the way you are. So Hannah does have, even though she didn't have what was thought to be the gold standard in that society, she actually had what a lot of women would love to have in this society, is unconditional approval, not having to do anything to earn the love and respect of her husband. But neither of these are enough for her, because neither of these are from God. And I think she realizes this, and she rejects both of these. So what does she do? Well, it says Hannah got up after eating, And then she goes and says this prayer that we know. But if you look up the Hebrew, verse 9, it says she got up, and the Hebrew indicates that this isn't just her standing up and maybe waltzing out the door. She had purposed something in her heart. There was a light bulb moment. She realized something fundamental, and she rose with a purpose and walked out to the tabernacle to make this prayer. So this is a very, very fundamental verse, because it's showing that there's something that happened inside Hannah's heart that changed everything for her, and is going to make this prayer that she says to God, it's going to make her heard in a very final way. It's going to finally get her to communicate with God in an effective way. And we're going to kind of be looking at why that is. So verse 11, let's look at the prayer she says. She makes a vow saying, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant, and remember and not forget your maidservant, but give your maidservant a son. So one verse, a lot here to look at. So you have her talking to God, and she uses this Hebrew phrase, Yahweh Shebaheth, which means Lord of many, Lord of multitudes, Lord of armies. Has a lot of different translations, but it is of the utmost respect that she's referring to God. She's referring to God as the sovereign ruler of all creation, the Lord God Almighty above all things. So she addresses him in his ultimate power first. But then she says something. She says, do not forget your maidservant. Look upon the affliction of your maidservant. So she's saying, even though you are an almighty God who knows everything, is above all things, I know that you care about the broken heart of a woman on the lowest rung of society. I know that you see me, a woman who is told by everyone else in the world that I am nothing. I know that the God who is the highest being of creation looks upon me and knows my heart, and knows what I'm going through, and knows how hard it is to be in my situation. She's absolutely right. And this very interesting prayer is that we ourselves can note and need to remember that God in his majesty knows us in our own situations and our hearts. So she begins to pray after denying the approval, rejecting the approval of society and her husband. She's now seeking God's approval, and she is telling God that the broken heart of a barren woman, she knows that it matters to him. And the Bible here is emphasizing how important it is for us to take our deepest thoughts, feelings, and emotions and take them to God. We have the ability, this avenue of prayer. We need to make sure we're using it to the utmost of our ability. We need to make sure we're not misplacing or misusing our inner desires. There's sort of, this spectrum of the great debate is, well, we have these desires and these wants and needs and feelings. What do we do with them? Well, some people will say, you follow them. You follow your instinct. You live it out in your life, and you express it as loudly and as clearly as possible for everyone to see. And then the other one would be, no, those are all wrong. You're supposed to repress them and push them down and completely ignore them. I think the whole point of having a creator, a being, and now an intercessor to help communicate is that we're supposed to take those feelings that we don't know what to do with, that confusion and that pain, we're supposed to pour that out to God and work through it with him. That's what prayer is there for. And just like Hannah, we need to make sure we're utilizing it for that reason. So what does she say here? She says, well, I'm going to pledge my son fully to God. And she says he's going to take a Nazarite vow. So, so she says this to him. And that's what I'm looking for. A razor shall never touch his head. So this is also really important, because this is part of the change that happens in Hannah, is in Numbers 6, it lays it out that if you wanted to be a priest, you had to be of a certain tribe, right? You had to be a Levite. The Levitical priesthood was the ones in charge of that. But you could also become a priest through a different means, is you could become what was called a Nazarite. You would take a Nazarite vow, and two of the big things is that you weren't to drink any alcohol or strong drink, and you were not to cut your hair. And you could, through this process, dedicate your life to the temple service, and you were like an assistant to the priest. And it was a lifelong dedication. This was something that you were going to be doing forever. So Hannah says, if you give me a son, I'm going to give him to you in this way. He's going to serve you, and he's going to be a priest. Now, if you don't know too much about it, or if you're looking at it at a service level, you would say, well, this kind of seems like Hannah's bargaining to me, right? Like, okay, well, if I get a son out of it, then I'll give him to you, and I'll make him a priest. But that's not what's going on here at all. Hannah is showing what she has realized is that I wanted a son for me, and it's not about me. If I have a son, it's going to be for you. There's a whole flip that happens here. Is that by making him a Nazarite and giving him away, she's giving up all the reasons that she initially wanted a son in the first place. A Nazarite isn't going to be of any economic use to your family because he's going to be off at the temple. You're not even going to get to spend time with him and have him around the house where Peninnah can see him because he's going to be off in the temple. You're going to be able to see him maybe once a year or so and visit him. So by giving him to God fully, she's also giving up her motherhood in a sense. She's going to have him for a very short time before he's going to be gone again. All the personal and cultural reasons for having a child were going to be removed by her doing this. So why? Well, she's giving up culture and status. She's giving up emotional fulfillment. Why would she even want a son at this point if this is the conclusion she's come to? Well, there's also a theological reason which is very interesting here, is that you have in Genesis 12 that great promise to Abraham, right? That there's going to be salvation that comes through his lineage, that through his numbers the world is going to be saved. And of course back then, they still didn't really understand what that meant or how that was going to come about, but they knew, Hebrew women, Israelite women, realized that birth was something very special. That birth was, I am contributing, I am playing a part in the ultimate role that God has. So perhaps she also realized that even by giving birth, being who I am and having the ability to give birth and give God a son, I am playing my part. And we know exactly that's more true than she could have ever imagined by giving birth to Samuel. So she no longer wanted a child for her, but for God. She wanted to bring life into the world, but she wanted to bring God's life into the world, not just for her own. So I guess you could think of it this way. Getting the child was the end for Hannah, and God was the means. The change in her heart was completely flipped. Serving God and having his will be done was the end, and having a child was the means. That's something we need to always make sure, is that God is our end and everything else is our means. So, something to note here, I don't think I'm reading too much into this here by saying these things, because if you look at verses 18 and 19, it says, the woman went on her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So, after saying this prayer, she found a sense of peace and a sense of comfort. She found it in herself to be able to eat something. And it says she was no longer sad. She's not even pregnant at this part. She doesn't know whether or not this prayer is going to be answered. So it's not like it was answered immediately and then she was happy. She found fulfillment in simply by doing this thing, and simply by realizing that God's will is the one that needs to be done. She finds fulfillment and happiness. So I really do think that this argument is the correct one to be made here. It's just definitely interesting to note that her resolve changes even before she's able to conceive, before her womb is opened up. So Hannah's son, we know she names him Samuel, and he becomes a great deliverer and a shadow of the Savior to come. And God had to wait to give her a child, because if she had a child before this, she would have had a child for all the wrong reasons. She would have had a child to dangle in the face of Peninnah and say, look, I have a son too, I can do it too, you're not that special. She would have crushed him with the weight of her expectations. She would have put all the societal pressures that she was feeling on Samuel, and he wouldn't have turned out the same. He wouldn't have been able to be used for God's purposes in the way that he was. So she arrives at peace after making this vow. God makes sure that she's not going to make an idol out of her son before he gives it to her. So God uses her suffering and sacrifice to bring about salvation. So we're going to look at Hannah's rejoicing. Is that you have this prayer, almost reads like a psalm. This rejoicing that she says in the first 10 verses of chapter 2. 1 Samuel chapter 2. We're going to look at a few of them. You can go through it on your own time, but it's really beautiful. Is that she does what we also need to do in our own prayer life. After our prayers are answered, after the suffering is turned to joy, we need to rejoice and tell God what it means to us. Is that the poorest of the poor are made princes through this process of Jesus coming into your life through baptism, of being made a Christian. And we see this even in the Old Testament here. Let's look at a few verses of how God reverses pain and turns it to joy. She says, verse 4, the bows of the mighty are broken, but those who have stumbled equip themselves with strength. The ones that are looked at as the mighty warriors, the ones with all the armor and the weapons, their weapons are going to break, but it's the people that stumble on the ground. It's the weak. Those are the ones that are going to have all the strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for bread, but for those who are hungry, they will cease to hunger. The barren women are going to give birth to 7. Not only are they going to have a couple kids, they will have many kids. But the one who has many children withers away. Once again, this reverse of the process. Through God, if you don't have anything, you will be given much. And if you have much, then you are going to have it taken from you. So he raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts up the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of honor and glory. And this one specifically I want to look at, because you have this idea of the ash heap, and that's something we still have today. The trash, the garbage bin. That is something that still culturally we look at. The lowest people are who? It's the ones who are out picking through other people's garbage to survive. Those are the people that are at rock bottom of society. Those are the ones, it can't get any lower for you than that. For you to be going through someone else's garbage in hopes that you can find something to help you survive. Hannah says, through God, that is where I am. He's picking me up from that. He's putting me in a place of royalty. The farthest place from the ash heap or the garbage heap is sitting at a table with nobles. That's what God did for her. And that's what God does for us today. So you have Hannah's rejoicing. And of course, to draw this into the New Testament for personal application, you have Jesus, who was crucified in disgrace. Crucifixion itself being the most disgraceful thing that you can experience, was led outside the gates of Jerusalem. And everybody looking at him as an onlooker said, well, that is obviously not the Son of God. That's obviously not the Savior we're looking for, because that is a man who belongs on the ash heap. That is a man who doesn't have any honor or glory. And all of the forefathers that came before, whether it be Abraham or Samuel or David, all of these people, they got honor and glory through power. If you look at the forefathers of Jesus, that's not him. But if you look at not just the men, but the foremothers of Jesus, the ones that came before, sort of what we talked about in Bible class, you're going to see something very similar to the temperament and the struggle of Jesus. You have Sarah at age 90, who is told that she's going to have a child, and she, for many years, is not able to. It's her that gives birth to Isaac. It's not Hagar. It's her that gives birth to Isaac. You have Leah, the one that was not wanted, the one that Jacob had to work the first time for, and he was tricked into marrying her. She wasn't what he was after. She was the second choice, or not really a choice. She was a default. It's her that brings forth Judah. It's her that brings forth the tribe from which the lineage of David is going to continue on, leading to Jesus, of course. So once again, you have these barren women who are suffering pain and disgrace, and who are looked upon as low, much like Jesus was, a low person, not much there to see. But just like that, just like the pain and suffering of those women that was turned to joy and used for something magnificent, that is exactly what happened. Jesus was a servant as well as a king. There was a magnificent transformation that happened there. Hannah didn't know how or why she was suffering the things she was, but she trusted God. And we don't know how much of Samuel's life Hannah got to see. We don't know how old she was when she died. It was very possible that she lived into advanced age and got to see Samuel continue on and do some of the remarkable things he did. And she got a sense of God's plan for Samuel. But there's no way she could have seen the entirety of it or understood the scope of it as we do today. We have the full revelation. We have the cross. We know what the ultimate plan was. So how much more of a responsibility is it for us to recognize that and be in awe of the power? Hannah was right to reject the love from Elkanah that was more than 10 sons, because it wasn't fulfillment from the true source. In Ephesians 5, it says that when we put on Jesus Christ in baptism, when we become Christians, we are found beautiful and perfect and without blemish. Jesus Christ, God looks at us. Through Jesus Christ, God looks at us, our true spouse, the one who is going to find favor with us, the one who does find favor with us, who delights in us. He says to us, the love that I have in you is more than 10 sons. It's more than 10 million or $10 billion. It's more than anything that anybody on this earth is going to give you. And that is what I want for you. That's the true love. That's the true acceptance, and it's what was won for us through Jesus Christ and his death on the cross. We are freed by the love from God, just like Elkanah, or just like Hannah was freed from the love of God, not by the love of Elkanah or the approval of Peninnah or anyone else. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up there, or we're going to end there rather. If there's anybody who is in pain, suffering, sorrow, feels low, feels disrespected, and is looking for approval from anywhere that's not God, and realizes that God is truly the only one that can give us the love that's worth more than anything else. If there's anything we can do to help you, please come forward and let it be known as together we stand and as we sing.